not just one or two persons in a family, but the whole community. The father was the head, the mother was expected to be subservient, and this takes us into the role of women. In China's case, women were definitely considered to be inferior, and she was not allowed to divorce her husband, even though her husband could divorce her. She was not allowed to inherit property, even though in some cases she did. The wife could only have one husband. The husband was allowed to take a second wife or take a concubine, if the concubine is like a lesser wife. If a husband died, the wife had to fight off her greedy relatives who would try to take what little she had, or try to coerce her to remarry, because then if she remarried, they could inherit all of her previous property. Again, this was their customs. They could also get her original dowry if she remarried. Now, another practice that the Chinese women had to endure that is not mentioned right here in this chapter, but it is mentioned elsewhere in the book, was the practice of foot binding. To define foot binding, yes?
I was going to say that basically back then it was a custom for like little kids or little girls specifically. It was attractive to have really, really, really small feet.
You're jumping ahead. You're teaching the lesson forward. Go ahead. Go ahead. You're teaching. That's what I was about to say.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, foot binding. Well, what was foot binding? It's where the little girls, from the time they were maybe preschoolers, were forced to wear tiny little shoes that would not allow their feet to grow.
The size of a cigarette box.
Yeah, okay. Very tiny, and it meant their feet did not grow from the time they were preschoolers, and this made them crippled. Now, I had a 21st century American boy say, "I don't find crippled women attractive." I said, "Fine and dandy. I don't either." But again, the Chinese men found this attractive. Now, and this is as plain as I want to get it forward. Supposedly, this deformation of the feet changed the shape of their legs to make them look more attractive during the sex act. And again, each of you can decide for yourself whether or not it was attractive. Again, to most American men, the whole idea is repulsive. And the practice of foot binding continued until the communist government outlawed it in 1950. Your authors say that when they visited China in 1980, they still saw some women who had their feet bound. This practice, though, is no longer done, except maybe in some very distant, remote areas of China where the communists have not been able to reach. Believe it or not, it was not. I mean, who wanted to keep the practice going? Believe it or not, it was the women. The older women who had had their own feet bound said, no, a woman should have their feet bound. I mean, this is what makes a woman a woman. And it made them crippled, and of course this guaranteed that they'd be subservient and submissive to their husbands and look attractive to their husbands. The nearest thing we have in the West to it is the practice of women wearing high-heeled shoes, but that is nothing to compare with foot binding. And also, I don't see as many high-heeled shoes as I once did. Hey, when I was a youngster, all the women dressed up in high-heeled shoes, and the result was they suffered from corns and bunions and fallen arches and a whole host of ingrown toenails, a whole host of other problems associated with it, but nothing to compare with the Chinese women. Now again, there are a few women who still wear high heels, but I think most of the women who do wear them sparingly. Okay. Now, something else, another practice that involved females. Young girls who were not needed were often killed. I mean, if the baby was a girl, oftentimes she was killed just because she was a girl. Or they might let her live for a few years, and if there came hard times, they would kill the babies. This is something the Chinese have done all the way down throughout their history, folks, all the way down. And yes, they did it in the 20th century. Because the population explosion got so great in the 40 and 50 years ago, the Chinese passed a law that couples were only allowed to have one child. Well, that one child had to be a boy because otherwise it wouldn't carry on the family name. Now this, I'm not saying it had to be, this is what they thought. So if the baby turned out to be a girl, they would kill her, practice called infanticide, and keep on trying to have children until they had a boy. Well, this speaking of carrying on the family name, they seem to have forgotten if they didn't have girl babies, they weren't going to be carrying on the family name anyway. The result was a generation of Chinese grew up, the ones a little bit younger than me, who found out they couldn't find wives because there were very few women available for them to marry, carry on the family. Now, how many of you have heard this outside the class here? Okay, okay, several hands are going up. Yeah, several apparently have heard it. Yeah, this went on, even in the 20th century. It went on at this time period too, but not to the same extent that it did then. All right. At the end of the last class on Tuesday, as I was closing class down with snow falling outside, one of the young women who had a computer came up to me and said, I just looked up Footbine. He said, those women to me looked awful. She was, anyway, that's, I said, well, you're thinking in terms of 21st century America, that's our standards. But, again, as far as I know, this isn't done anymore. Chinese novel, again, brought about by one of the other inventions of Chinese. They're believed to have invented the novel, and the printing press helped them to copy it, write a novel and copy it down. Don't worry about it though, because again, I know almost nothing about Chinese literature. So I'll move on to Japan. Your book talks about the Tokugawa Japan. Here's what I want you to remember about Japan. They, for many years, tried to lock foreigners out. They wanted to isolate themselves. They believed that foreigners were bad influence. So they practiced a policy of getting rid of foreign influence. Now, the Jesuits came in and tried to convert them to Christianity and made some converts, even among the nobles. But the Chinese wound up expelling all Christians, all Christian missionaries, and basically all Europeans, except for, your book says, one little Dutch town. And to this day, I'm talking about 2014, the Chinese do not encourage foreign immigrants to come in and move in. They want to keep their islands exclusively for the Japanese, which is something that they have done. No, people, what they did 400, 500, or 600 years ago, it is very important to us today because, I mean, you might have the attitude, I don't care what they did 400 or 500 years ago. I do. They're still doing the same thing today. In a different form, perhaps, but still for the same reasons. Something else I want to say about Japan, and this is going to become important later. They have had the same dynasty for 2,600 years. Our present Japanese emperor can trace his ancestry back to the year 600 BCE. Why is that important? Well, for one thing, at the end of World War II, the Japanese just begged us, will you please promise you'll let us keep our emperor? We want to keep our emperor. They date time based on the rule of an emperor, in the third year of a certain emperor. Now, the present emperor has been on the throne, I believe, 24 years, so if I'm right, this will be the 24th year of the emperor. And he looked on the emperor as being God, and the emperors wanted to keep a divine status. In actual reality, most of the emperors were nothing more than figureheads, and the ruling was done by prime ministers who would come and go. But they always revered the emperor as being a god, and they counted time from him. So nobody ever overthrew him because it would almost be like overthrowing God. So they kept the same ruling family, and this is something that no other group of people can boast of. Same ruling family for 2,600 years.